Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Conversations with the Archbishop. It's a gorgeous morning, and it's great for us to be here together. My name is Deborah Safri Collins, and I'm the moderator for our conversation this morning. And in my day job, I'm the head of chaplaincy at the Brotherhood of St. Lawrence. It's my great privilege to welcome you and to welcome our speakers this morning with the Archbishop. May I first acknowledge country. May I acknowledge the land on which we are so privileged to walk. May I acknowledge the elders, past, present, and emerging. And in this week, may we reflect upon hope and love and possibility. Our conversation this morning is about the cost of living crisis and mental health. And joining Archbishop Philip this morning is Casey Chambers and Scott Harrower. Casey Chambers is the Executive Director of Anglicare Australia. She is an accomplished CEO with extensive national experience in government and the community sector and brings widespread hands-on experience in policy, advocacy, government relations, service provision, community development, corporate governance and finance. Casey is experienced in working in the fields of homelessness, disability, mental health, alcohol and other drugs, both in Britain and Australia, and has worked in large and medium social service organisations across Australia. I know that Casey has worked with Anglicare Australia for quite a number of years and has been the extraordinary lead of an organisation that seeks to bring together many of our Anglican welfare agencies and to see that together they lobby and continue to work on behalf of those who are experiencing disadvantage. When not at work, she enjoys an outdoor lifestyle, listing hobbies as canoeing, walking, piloting, and light aircraft and camping. And I know that she can add a lot of hiking to that list as well. And she's an active member of her local rural fire service. She holds degrees in psychology and a master's in business administration and in ethics. Dr. Scott Harrower is a Ridley graduate and an ordained Anglican minister and was brought up by missionary parents in Argentina, and his wide-ranging ministry covers work in several countries. Currently, Scott heads up the Graduate Certificate in Mental Health and Pastoral Care at Ridley, along with teaching theology, church history and philosophy of religion. He's also a global engaged scholar and a strong student mentor. Scott is a published author and has done an enormous amount of work in the area of history and theology, but in this context has written books God of All Comfort, Trauma and Recovery, and the Trinity and the Trauma in Safe Churches. He's currently assisting the Ukraine and Argentina in the areas of trauma and recovery. And when he's not doing that, he tells me he loves to be with his dogs and gardening. Please make them both welcome this morning as we begin our conversation. Over to you, Archbishop.
Thank you, Deborah. Well, good to see you, and what a beautiful morning, contrast to the last time I was here in the middle of winter. And we have this important topic because in our context, this is a pretty pressing thing, but I just wanted to acknowledge for those of you who know the place that I'm still a bit of a shock hearing about the destruction of the Al Ali Arab Christian Hospital in Gaza, a place that Joy and I visited 15 years ago, and it seems that it's been hit by missile strikes overnight, and there's many hundreds have been killed. And so we live in a global context where it's not as if we're sort of struggling with first world problems, but we are dealing with real issues, and other people deal with equally real issues that are of a different kind of scale to the parameters that we expect. And I think that the topic we open up today really is one that is about many people increasingly who are pushed into a space that they probably never thought they would be in. And we will hear as we unfold this what are the edges of pressure in our society with cost of living broadly described, but the impact that has on people's housing security, homelessness, the kind of situations that people might never have imagined they'd be pushed into. And on a global scale, you can see that goes right through to quite incredible dislocation and loss. So I'd just like to open up the question a bit, because we want to look at this, and especially in the context of what the Christian community can do. The Al Ali Hospital is one that is an Anglican hospital now. It's been operating about 140 years until last night, and our Anglican Overseas Aid partners had been quite involved there in establishing some breast screening and other cancer diagnosis services. So we're very aware that the Christian Church, the Anglican Church, has this kind of strong impetus for a social engagement. And we'll try and explore some of that too. What does it mean for Christian communities to be engaged in the world, and how might they do that in a rich and distinctive way? So I suppose, Casey, just start us off with how, in your network of agencies, are you seeing the changes? What's changing in the face of need that presents itself to agencies across your network?
Thank you, Archbishop. Yeah, we're certainly seeing more and more people coming to what we call our material aid and emergency relief services. They're services where people can come along if they're having trouble making ends meet in their budget. And we've run those for many, many years. And many of those services are run out of church parishes. There's government funding, but many of those government dollars are made more by the people in those parishes. What we're seeing in those is more people coming more often for more help. And that's, the quantity of people coming. They're coming more often, but they're coming for more help. So it's not just the food budget that's not meeting. We're seeing people coming, presenting with need to pay their rent every week, which is obviously a lot of money. But the other point is that we're seeing different people. So we're seeing that that poverty or that cost of living crisis climb the income brackets. Those services have traditionally, although I'm talking probably before the global financial crisis now, been for people who've been using welfare services or who are precariously employed. What we're seeing now is that a full-time income and even 2 incomes in a household are not enough to inoculate you against that poverty. But I did also want to call our attention back. I know we're talking about those people who come to us and say, we never thought we'd be here. This isn't who we thought we were. But I did just want to remind us that it's not just that middle class problem, although that's still a very real problem. We at Anglicare Australia did some research recently looking at how much it costs to be poor. And we named that the poverty premium. And we looked at some categories of expenditure. And we found, for example, that if you're on a low income, you'll pay 93% more for groceries. Now, that's just an inability to take advantage of bulk savings. So that kind of makes sense. But some of the other things that didn't make as much sense, you'll pay 45% more for credit and finance because you're paying more interest because you're a worse kind of risk, I guess. The worst we found was 142% for data on your phone because you're prepaying. And again, some of those will make sense, particularly to anyone with an economics background. It's risk and reward. But when you really look at the poverty premium, the one that really shocked me was we sought out insurance quotes for the same car with the same rego. Everything was the same. And we took it in one of the poorest suburbs in Sydney and one of the most expensive suburbs in Sydney. I'm sorry we did this one in Sydney. We did public transport on the Myki card, and that was a 20% premium. But that same car in those 2 suburbs, it was 61% more expensive to insure that car in the lower socioeconomic suburbs. So the market is not working for people who are in poverty, but those costs are so much more for people who are at the lower end of our socioeconomic ratio. So I just wanted to remind ourselves of that as well.
And Scott, I painted a bit of a picture not as precisely as you will, but of people who perhaps encounter the great trauma of not expecting to be in a place they find themselves to be. Do you want to open that up a bit about, we use trauma, and I suppose we can incline to think it's only in really enormous things you might feel it, but it probably isn't always at that end of the scale that these things build up to us.
Sure, so trauma is used to describe horrific, great events which are overwhelming and might kill us, or there's a threat of death. But another way of speaking about trauma is also everyday overwhelming events in which you sense that your life is not worth living and no good can come out of it, and you feel your capacity for life is diminished. So it's an ordinary sense of trauma, and the cumulative effects of that kind of sense of being overwhelmed and life isn't worth living, the effects of those are described according to PTSD categories as well as the great traumas. And what we're seeing when Casey says more people are seeking more help more often is that those people are experiencing a sense of being overwhelmed and that their lives cannot bring any good to themselves or to others, and they're giving up. So what they're losing is a sense of safety, that you're safe in the world, sense of self, who I am, that's gone. Story, you thought your life was going in one direction, you might flourish, you like to think about yourself as someone who may have friends and family and interests, medium term, well, that's just gone too because you're living in your car now. So you've lost a sense of safety, lost a sense of self, you've lost a sense of story, where you're going, and community connections are pretty hard to sustain when you feel terrible about yourself because you're accessing help all the time in a way that you never thought you would or anyone in your circle would. So there's a lot of shame and isolation. You put those 4 losses together in a context where you can't meet your basic needs, and there's a huge problem with people taking their lives, suicidal ideation, and withdrawing from one another. And the costs are huge in our community because we've got people who are unfortunately so consumed with just trying to survive that we're really not there for others in the way that we could have been or hoped to be otherwise. So for example, we might think of someone who was wanting to be like a footy coach or a netball coach in their local context because they benefited from that as a kid, but now they're so overwhelmed with issues to do with the cost of living and having lost a real sense of self and hope that thinking about helping out in the community is just a pipe dream, it's just something for other people. And they feel terrible about that too. So the cumulative effect of the cost of living on top of mental health distress is really significant, and in the southeast where I live, we're really feeling it.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. And Casey, I know you've spoken to people who are living on Centrelink benefits. I think it was a project called Asking Those Who Know. What are the kind of insights that you gained out of those projects, of the research? You know, Anglicare Australia is quite leading in these questions of research, and annually we hear about the affordability from housing and those things. But tell us what people who were telling you about their life on Centrelink benefits.
Well, yeah, it's echoing what Scott's saying. And first of all, I should say that when we did this research, I was surprised by one thing in particular. So we spoke to 621 people who were using Centrelink benefits to live on, because we figured out that realistically, you should put people at the centre of things. You should ask the people who know about the things you're asking about. I'll get to the results in a minute, but one of the things that most surprised me was what we heard from government was this was the largest number of people that had ever been asked about living on Centrelink benefits. So little old Anglicare Australia was the first to ask a proper sample of people who were experiencing these services, what it was like to be on them. So, you know, they've been around for decades, so why we haven't asked before then amazes me. So we asked 621 people. Not a huge sample, but, you know, there you go. What they told us was that, they told us lots and we asked them lots. But what's, I guess, relevant in this conversation, Archbishop, is the things that system does to them, the things that it puts them through, the stories it persuades them to know about themselves and for others to know about them, affected their mental health. People said they felt worse after being on Centrelink benefits for a set amount of time. And we could actually see it when we asked them, how's your self-esteem, or what are you feeling, and the length of time they'd been on those benefits. Interestingly, and I hadn't planned to bring it up until you mentioned it, Scott, another thing that they mentioned was their ability to help others diminished the longer that they've been on these benefits. We didn't say, have Centrelink benefits diminished your ability to help others? We just asked about that. And you could see that the process of being on Centrelink benefits actually diminished people's capacity and diminished people's mental health. And it doesn't need to be that way. All that person is saying is that at the moment, I don't have economically paid employment. But what the Centrelink system's saying, and it was harsher at that time, we did it under the previous government, the outcomes haven't changed much, some of the language is gently changing. But the whole language, the whole narrative, and in fact, if you look at the Royal Commission into Robodebt, the first statement, the very first sentence that Justice Catherine puts out there is that the language and the narration is so poor that it was leading to these kind of outcomes.
And Scott, I go to many parishes, as you see, and often I'll see people, when we have the communion service, they hold the offertory, people will bring up some food in a basket that will go to some providers in their local community. So I kind of sense that people have got a heart to want to make a difference. Now, that's, I suppose, one thing, some material comfort and support that people give through agencies and other things, but what are you seeing as some of the richness that a Christian community can bring into the kind of areas you've looked at?
It's what Casey said, which is putting people at the centre. Christians believe that God is loving and that we're called to love one another. And so what I'm seeing is initiatives by churches where people are put at the centre, they're listened to empathetically, and if there are some needs that can be met by the skills and supports of that local community, it can happen. So let me give you a great fun initiative. Where I live, there's a problem with loneliness. People just don't have community connections. So a really fun initiative has been that somebody who happens to have access to lots of board games because of their work has set up a once a month, come for free, so no cost, board games. And anyone's welcome, and we'll put on dinner for you, and you can come in, you can play complex games, easy games, or you can just sit around with others who are deliberately there just to chat and connect with you. This is an initiative that was set up last year, and it's going gangbusters. So we're putting people at the centre, we're loving people, we noticed that there was a problem with loneliness, and we've just opened up the church, and people are coming in. And it's been so successful that we're thinking about spinning it off more often. And Christian communities can do that in lots of ways. But I think the key is to love and to put people at the centre.
Yeah, I think that, well, I see that in many places. I mean, not far from here, you can go up to St Peter's Eastern Hill. They run a breakfast program every morning there. Christchurch, Geelong, many places I visit, and there they become very important, I think, for the community of people who participate in those places. So that is a rich thing. And I suppose I wonder, because we also have seen in Australia, I think the growth of well, sometimes it's through consolidation of small agencies coming together to form bigger agencies, which we've had some experience of. But I think we've seen the growth of the size of agencies and their professionalism. And Casey, you've got some impressive and very professional entities in your network. How does that sit alongside of that kind of micro-level attention to the person, in the one-to-one way?
I think it sits beautifully alongside, within, around, underpins, overarches, all those kind of things. So those large agencies are often a conglomeration of those those small initiatives that, when we say small, they're life-changing to many people. And there's so many examples of them, and they're so thrilling. It's what keeps me, as Deb said, I've been in this role a while, but it's one of the things that really keeps me in this role, to see those kind of initiatives. But I think what you're getting to, without that joy of those small services and things, what you're getting to, Archbishop, is that issue between where we see neighbours reaching out and where we see professional services. And that there's a real role for professional services when we think about trauma, or when we think about people really in need of real professional response, whether that's due to an addiction issue or due to the fact that they simply don't have somewhere to live and we need to find that. But we do also have that sense that we are people and we can reach out to each other. We don't need a Cert 4 to hold a baby or to respond to someone who has a disability. And I think there's a balance between those things. But when we see those parishes or those groups of volunteers that do assist and that do step into that work, and I should say as well, I think there's a real dignity of giving that sometimes we take away from those people who are in poverty or who have mental health issues, who are, in one instance, the recipient of a service, and I think we should never do that. We are all simultaneously the recipient and the giver of service, whether it's as taxpayer and welfare beneficiary, we seem to polarize those, or whether it's, accepting assistance when we go to the GP in the week and then giving assistance when we're the person who's, behind the tea counter or something. But I think there is a tension there, and we need to be careful that we don't professionalise the wrong services, but we also need to be careful that we don't reach out with goodwill, but overreach into some of those other areas that our more professional services take care of. So I think there's a role for both. I think of them sometimes as sort of small letter social capital and large letter service, and there's a real sense that our agencies, I think, and our people are in the best space to interweave those and be both the weaver of that fabric and the seamstress that makes that fabric into things.
I've certainly known people, like I'm thinking of the grocery baskets that sometimes come up and are presented at church, so people for whom they're not people of much means, but the intentionally thinking of others when they're even doing their fairly meagre personal shopping is really important part of their own Christian spirituality, and so it always, represents to me that kind of attentiveness at a very personal level to others when people are thinking of their own needs. So it is quite inspiring, and the passionate leadership I think we have from our professional staff in the agencies I'm in contact with is also really impressive, because people have that, they bring the professionalism, but they bring a real, passion for service and change. Because I guess that we touched it a little bit, but this whole thing about maybe people blaming themselves, Scott, or does the society blame people? We've, often heard people, you're in the deserving poor, or, we had probably back 20 years ago, one of our federal politicians talking about people being lifters or leaners, and, there seems to be often a moral value attributed to people's difficult circumstances in kind of a way that the fairly squalid exhibition of wealth by the wealthy doesn't get the same moral approbation. So just tell us what you think about that.
So there's a classic Aussie song by a band called the Celibate Rifles, Coulda Shoulda, and they talk about could have been middle class, should have been middle class, should have washed my teeth daily, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And basically, it's a person in their 40s and 50s looking back to the way that society decided that they should have lived and what it's like to live in the aftermath. And I think, today, one of the sad things is that instead of being able to reflect on our lives, and have a bit of joy looking back on it, a little bit of regret, I think the sense for many of the people that I mix with is that it's overwhelming regret. And that a few things have gone wrong for them, and as a consequence, there's a whole cascade. That means that they're very angry people. So there's a guy that I train with at the gym quite frequently. He lives in his car, and he accesses the gym for showering and stuff before work as well as everything else. And he's just angry because he feels like he was let down by everyone. And that means that he feels that engaging in relations is basically impossible for him. But he's only 50 years old. He's got a lot to give, and he's a really loving guy with a big heart. But he feels that because his life's kind of cascaded down and he hasn't got a great CV, he's gone through the employment training systems and all that, and it's sort of worked out. But he just feels that he's been disregarded by society, and he's just going to be on the margins forever. And I'm really concerned, just as his mate, that he's really living into that. And it's very hard when people are alone to say, look, there's a number of us that think you were great, you know, and can we walk with you in certain ways? So it takes a lot of friendship and a lot of love to get around people, to help people know that they're not just how they feel about themselves. There's much more to them, but we just need to show people lots of love and lots of encouragement to help them. And the great thing is, and you said this to do with service, is that there's a ton of research about if you find someone who's in a very difficult situation, and medium term they can be in a position where they can help others and regain a sense of agency, they're going to be far better off medium term. Because there's all these psychological benefits to helping others. And trauma literature has recognised that what churches and agencies can do is help people regain a sense of agency as they're encouraged to be there for others in the ways that they can. So it's step by step, but it's conversations and mentoring and support. So again, it's the person at the centre, helping them regain agency as they're surrounded with everyday friendship and love at the same time as services that don't diminish them as human beings. But I tell you what, someone who's got a trauma background and family violence and who's been through the system for 20 years, it's a medium-term road back. So we need to be patient. And that's why there's a lot of studies on medium-term friendship is super important. There's just been a book released on the one key to be happy. It's from the Harvard longitudinal study. It began in 1934. It's a study on generations of people, how to be happy. And the one insight is relationships are the key to being happy, but it's not just one relationship with a spouse or close relationships with your family. You need relationships at the checkout at Woolies. You need relationships medium term. You need workplace relationships. You need deep, sustained relationships in families as well. We need all kinds of relationships. But when people are down, the only relationships they tend to get are when they pay for them because they're accessing a service, or when they're drawing on a service. There's no free relationships. We just don't engage with each other in a friendly, loving way. So I think just as a society, we need to put persons and love at the centre again. And you know what? Take your time at the checkout and talk to people. Find out how they're going. Engage with them. Get to know their name. It's in the little interactions that we can love and make a difference. This is what the ethicist O'Donovan says. He just says, don't overcomplicate it. In every interaction, be loving, seek their best. Easy. It's Jesus' one command, love one another. If we all did it, I think we could really change things.
Yeah, I believe that's true. I think we can. I was just reflecting as you were speaking. When I started this breakfast conversation journey about a decade and a half ago, it was a time that the Choir of Hard Knocks was being put together here in Melbourne, and just how inspirational that was for people who'd otherwise not had much participation to be, on a premier sort of stage in different places, being confidently able to serve others by some music. And there was a lovely era of an inspiring and transformational event for everyone. I think everyone then feels we've got a better society, we've got a richer life because we see other people flourishing more than they might have without that. So
and you get the same when local footy clubs waive fees for kids so they can join in. And then it means the parents can join in and siblings can join in. They've got a place to be other than watching TV or on YouTube. You've just got to open things up a bit. And you can do it. Yeah.
Great. Well, good to hear you're taking your part in doing it. And Casey, tell us about people who are entering some of these situations of poverty in their mature years, their adult, perhaps after some time. We know, I suppose, a classic situation after marriage, separations and divorce, people getting near to the end of their employed life. Particularly women are finding this housing issues have suddenly changed and people living in very insecure housing. But that's probably other situations where there is an age transition factor that is relevant.
Yeah. I'm going to take a bit of license with that question because I'm going to come to it. But the age thing as well, one thing I did want to just talk about in terms of the mental health impacts of the cost of living was the effects on children. So I'm working quite closely with an academic who is studying the effects of living in poverty on children. And so we know that with adults, there's anxiety, there's depression, there's feelings of worthlessness, there's feelings of how could I not provide for my, kids. There's just that sense of juggling, how am I going to find the rent and the utility bills and then the car insurance and all those kind of things. But she's looking at what it means with children. And those children are telling her things like, well, I worry about, I don't like to eat the extra slice of bread. That was a direct quote from one child. Or I worry about, we hear about kids not inviting their friends back after school because nothing can, they can't have a snack on the table. And that starts those relationships and that dearth really early on. And this academic is actually looking at the effects on children's ability to form and nurture relationships as they go through in more economically impoverished childhoods. So it's very real, and then the quotes from those children are just heartbreaking. They're very mundane in a way, but they're just heartbreaking. But certainly the other group, or another group that we're concerned about, is older women in particular, because in many ways they are falling foul of our very transactional capitalist society in only monetary ways. So for many people, there's lots of things going on. But with these women, it's often the first time they've come into contact with any service. It's often a very quick road from whether it's divorce or whether it's getting out of a job that was, just paid the rent, maybe. They might have worked in retail here in the city, have moved further and further out as the rents got more and more expensive. One day that sum doesn't quite work to pay to come in any longer. And it's a very quick route to them living in their car, if they have a car, or into what I would call houselessness, because often those women, for that group of women, it is a simple shelter that's missing at that stage. And it's a very difficult place to be in. It's a very difficult place for the way that our society works to turn around. So ideas like shared equity or giving people a hand with a mortgage. If someone's 60, it's a harsh demographic reality that they've possibly not got time to pay off a mortgage and start from scratch. So there's a sense that we need to do something to push them along that track because they haven't got the same track as someone who's in their 20s. But they're also a group of people who have an awful lot to give. And so often for us, it's about housing, but then unlocking some of that other capacity. And I think there's a sense for me too about unlocking people's empathy, not just this group, but with everybody. Whilst there's a time while poverty is climbing the income bracket, if you like, there's a chance perhaps to unlock some of that empathy. And so we've got services where those women are being housed and we're working on something medium term for them. But at the same time, they're working in emergency relief services as volunteers. There's a circularity, and I think that's one of the important things, to make sure that we do have that capacity to give as well as to accept service.
Yeah, I like that phrase, unlocking people's empathy. That's a powerful image.
It's something that I really was very optimistic about during the global financial crisis. We could unlock empathy. We could gather some of those environmentally more sustainable things. You saw people cutting back on expenditure. You saw people using the last piece of bread or whatever. As, you know, environmentally, those things really matter. We didn't do it. And I'd like to think that this is a time where perhaps we can try and do that. One of the things we constantly see is that, and I don't want to reflect on the referendum, but I suspect there's an analogy or there's a theme there as well, is very few people who are comfortable and well off know someone who is on Job Seeker. So very few people, and we've polled this, very few people actually know how little Job Seeker is. And when they do know, people are really shocked. Yeah. We have a wonderful project during Lent in some dioceses. It's different dioceses each year, so people just pick it up. But there's some Bible studies that go along with it, but also that sense that let's live on the amount of Job Seeker for the period of Lent. And let's put what we save into a donation. But it's really salutary. And I would say that for me, it's impossible to live on Job Seeker, but it's impossible to even experience it because I've got a fullish pantry, I've got a car that's insured, I've got, you know, some of those annual things. If you live on it for 2 or 3 years, you're really very diminished, but economically diminished. But I think there are some real ways that we should try to un-other people who are in these situations so that we can't just assume that they're not like us, that somehow things are cheaper for them. And the point with the referendum was I think many people don't know Indigenous people in their own friendship circles. But I think if we can do that, if we can break down some of those barriers, we can go a long way towards unlocking empathy.
And Scott, my own assessment is we're living in a more anxious world, and I think a lot of anxiety probably is not without reason. If you see wars where you didn't think there'd be a war, you see the tragedy of these armed conflicts, and if you follow the news, you know, we once were thinking about Yemen, then we're thinking about, we're hearing about Sudan, and then we're hearing about Ukraine, and now we're hearing about Gaza. It's almost like but the thing you first heard about is no longer commented on, but presumably it's still running in a tragic way, but where there's, how does that kind of corporate anxiety feed into, I suppose, does it tighten us down, or do we become more empathetic to others under stress?
Well, I don't know if you guys saw, have you been paying attention on Monday night, the TV show? You remember Sam Pang was asking, how do I be happy? Remember? That's one of the questions that's arising now. We're all very anxious, alone, with less resources. How am I happy? Well, the answer on the show was ice baths, right? Because it raises dopamine. So that's what the wellness community will tell you. Yeah. As I was driving in today, there was an ad like, oh, it's me time, and it was like some kind of sex toy. Like, that's kind of going to make you happy. So it's like ice baths, sex toy. Is there anything else? And Christians want to say, well, you know, there is a resurrection by Jesus in history, and he sends his Spirit into our lives, and he's going to come again and renew things. So Christians are invited to live not just in terms of quick dopamine hits, but into something bigger. That's the big idea. And Nick Cave is an Aussie musician that gets this in his stories and his poems. He calls us to live into something bigger. And my sense is, unless we can have a sense of hope, we're really in trouble, because things aren't great and we're bombarded by bad stories all the time. And here's the interesting thing. There's some recent volumes on the psychology of hope. Lots of studies that have come out recently by Oxford and Cambridge and Routledge. And in those studies, they show clear correlations between having a sense of hope and holding down a job, maintaining healthy relations, having better health outcomes, and likely to participate in volunteering. So if you do have a sense of hope, you're likely going to be better off, and so is your community. The problem is that in our society, we're not really happy to talk about transcendent hope And we're just offering people mostly short to medium term quick fixes to feel good, and it's not really hope. So I think one of the key things that Christianity has to offer is this sense of hope in which you can participate. And I tell you what, I'm nearly 50. The longer you live as a Christian, the longer you see hope lived out in other people's lives. And it's actually very inspiring. And it changes you. Like Richard and I, we've been around here in Melbourne churches for about the same time. And we know a lot of the same people that have been very inspiring to us both. And they've shown us what hope looks like in the everyday. And it's very ordinary, which is what you said. I think love and hope are very mundane things. And we just need to be okay with that, but then live into the mundane and be friendly, neighbourly, kind to one another. And the thing is, there's also lots of studies on this. As you become more virtuous, as you become kinder and more thoughtful and more gentle, and you grieve over terrible things, if you embody those virtues, it's better for your mental health and the mental health of the people with whom you're engaging. So there's actually real benefit in us becoming fuller people that are there for one another rather than smaller transactional consumers.
So in a world of, I suppose, we tend in Australia to look towards governments to form policy positions and then to fund programs that arise out of those positions. What do you think, Casey, is the kind of the policy setting that starts making some change here? Because we are talking about things which seem to be only, they're very personal about people and the capacity of, a government policy and even funding directed towards it is going to run up against some limits. What's the best policy mix to go forward and make an impact on some of these things we're talking about?
That's right, because they are small, they are mundane, they are everyday. But the government can either disable or enable those things. And I also always want to point out that the government is not separate to us. We put them there, we're responsible for them, we should support them, we should own them, we should hold them to account. Because by putting them out there, we're doing another form of othering, we're excusing them. We're saying, I can't swear, but those flipping politicians who sit in Canberra, they're humans like we are, and I think by doing that we're letting them away with lots of things. So we do need that very active democracy. There's some really basic things that we can all change at the moment. I always fall over this, but the stage 3 tax cuts, we've still got those out there. They are going to bake in a much less fair taxation system. Whatever way we look at it, they flow money from women to men. They flow it from the regions to the cities. They flow it from the poor to the rich. They're not fair, and fairness is important to human beings. It's what makes people who are on the wrong side of it angry, and it's what makes people who are on the right side of it entitled and distant, I think. So we need to just stop those. We need to give the politicians an excuse to stop those. That would actually retain something like $260 billion back into the budget that we can then spend on goodies. And goodies can be basics like decent aged care. If we've got decent aged care, then we can start to think that some of the volunteering, and vast amounts go into aged care of volunteering, but instead of those volunteers being involved in some of the necessary care activities, they can be involved in the board games, they can be involved in newspaper readings, they can be involved in some of those things that affect loneliness. So I think taxation is really important. I think language is incredibly important. I don't think we've probably seen a vast difference in the change of government, except with a default setting in some of the language. And I think that is important in how we see ourselves. So I think this hugely individualized politics, the assumption that our way of doing things does make that is easy to interpret as poverty being a moral failure of the individual, not a structural failure of the society. And so if we can change that to rethink about that, then that's a very good thing, and I think would go a long way to addressing that. And there's a great precarity around at the moment, and has been growing, in jobs. The fact that a full-time job won't actually inoculate you against poverty. But not just that precariousness of economic jobs, the fact that we don't recognise many other ways of participation. So, I'll be quite radical. We talk about a universal permanent income. Again, when we've done research, people are saying that if they had that, they would volunteer more. They'd spend longer with family. They'd do more study. They'd do all these things which are future-based, which are hope-based, which are about being involved. So I do think we would do well to stop thinking that somebody who's involved in making sex toys or running exploitative brothels or is a hedge funder is actually worth more because they're making an economic dollar than someone who is caring for country or someone who is a leader of Aboriginal kids in their area. We need to rethink those kind of things. Now, that seems a policy that seems a long way off, but times like these may allow for some of those radical policies. And the last thing I would say is that to put some of that power back into the hands of people that know what that matters. And that's services like ours, but it's also the people at the centre of those services. They know, we all know what's going to make better for us. And those are the people we're just not asking. We're not asking those who know.
And Scott, what's your make a difference into the future kind of policy advice?
Well, I agree entirely with you, and and again, it comes about putting the person at the centre. So recently I've been dealing with some people where they are older and one of them has to end their work so they can look after their wife. But the thing is, the social support isn't there for them to care. So basically, he's running off to work and trying to squeeze in supporting his wife and caring for her huge health needs where he can. That's absolutely unworkable. And I think we need to begin by sorting out the barriers that there are for people to care for one another. And if we can start sorting out the steps that you need to go through in Centrelink and all that so people can care for one another, then they will care. Because Casey's right. Most of us actually want to do the right thing by others. But we're just so incredibly busied and red taped out that we're exhausted. And we have less of an ability to care. So I'd love us just to chip away at reachable solutions and give us room to breathe and then recognise that, oh man, I do want to look after others and others want to be involved too. And then together we can move forward. So again, it's step by step, it's small procedural change that will make a big difference.
Deborah's going to come back now and open up some opportunity of interaction. You can either be some questions. We've got Paul McDonald here, the CEO of Anglicare Victoria. I'm going to put him in the spot after a while, but we'll see what sort of interaction you'd like amongst us in the audience this morning.
Thank you, Archbishop. Thank you, Malcolm.
Sure. Malcolm Tadgell. I understand that inflation's been increasing over the last couple of years, but what are the causes of things getting worse? Why are things getting worse now compared to what might have been 5 years ago or 10 years ago? Because that's the picture that I'm picking up from it.
We might open that up now. Yes, what's your view?
I think, and thanks for that question, I'm not an economist. I left that behind in my master's area. But there is a different level of inflation. I think there is instability. And certainly when we talk to people, some of their fears are those very existential things. They start talking about hyperinflation, but they soon move to wars, to AI, and to climate change. And I think it's easy to have a sense that things are coming to a head. But I also don't hold that separately to having hope. I think things might have to come to a head to have that hope. But I think on a less esoteric grounds, I think we are operating an economic system and a transactional economic system that worked better when most people were comfortable working or middle class, and the people who were in our welfare system were who it was designed for. I'm thinking of the early 60s, where it was a safety net and it was a transitional thing where we had full employment in terms of the workforce quantity, and where being fully employed meant that you were doing okay. That's not caught up. That's not caught up with where people are at with the ongoing costs. It rattles my brain as to why housing, we thought we had some of the answers around housing and why it was so difficult. We recently did, again, some more research that found that middle Australia, the real jobs we rely on, could not afford to rent. So a nurse in Melbourne would not have been able to affordably rent 92% of the properties that were available, that kind of thing. We thought it was supply and demand. COVID kind of threaten that thinking. So we've still got to work out what it is about housing. But I do think that we're working an old economic system that we haven't either let caught up with where we are, or we haven't taken the reins of and said we want it to be different, and we want to encourage participation, and we want to bring people in from the bottom, and we want to assist people at the top to help that.
And I think there's, I haven't seen anyone analyse this, but there was the period of time during the COVID pandemic when all of the social welfare benefits were increased. And I think that was done with a view that increasing that would actually stimulate the economy because people would spend that money. I don't think it was primarily or the flourishing of the people.
Christian.
It was sort of stimulating the economy. But I think the part that hasn't been understood is what impact that had on people, because many people in our community had a sustained period of time feeling a bit of a sense of relief that they could make ends meet, and then that was pulled back again. And so I wonder if it's not really answering the question about inflation, but I think inflation's at work. So it's been up there, it's dropped down there, and then inflation's kind of pushing the value down here. So I think it's really going back to that lived experience understanding. And if we were to better understand the lived experience of people, even over that 3-year period, I suspect there'd be a story a bit like that to be told.
There certainly was. What we saw from people then was that they caught up with things. They paid down debts. They made small savings. One woman said to me that she'd bought her child a birthday present for the first time. It wasn't a big present. It was actually a paperback book. But then people also started to invest into the future. They did training. They did, decorate their rental property or whatever it was. But then tragically, what people said to us afterwards was, we now know that the government can do it. They've taken it away. So what we now know is that people don't care about us. And that was what we heard over and over and over again. And I would just say that it's absolute proof that poverty is a policy choice. It's not a wicked problem, because we can solve it, and we can solve it pretty damned easily. We just put more money in. It's so easy. But yeah, it was very sad to hear that from people who saw what that said about them from society.
Sure, views gone.
The other angle is related to yours, which is that with the increase in inflation and job instability, people are realising that when they can't make it, they're not just maybe disappointed or angry at the government, but they realise that their family networks or other networks that they had, like their mates' trading networks, actually they're not ultimately there for them. So there's a real disappointment, not just in government and the system, but actually like in your family, in your mates. So at the end of the day, when you're moving into your car, they're not taking you in. Your mates actually aren't getting your work, where you just assumed they would, but they're not. So because of that diminished social capital, at the same time, you've got a double anger and a double frustration with the government, and then a disappointment of kind of reasonable hopes and expectations that you had. So then you end up, especially with men, very angry, very isolated men, who can only access spaces when they pay for them. There's nowhere they can come for free. And churches are one of those few places where they're welcome and invited for free. So it's a disappointment with the government and also with reasonable expectations for networks and families.
Paul.
Thanks for the discussion, Archbishop and panel, and Paul McDonald from Anglicare Victoria. And a couple of observations of maybe of the Australian characteristics, if I could. Where social policy, we're conservative, in the sense of we don't like to necessarily on social policy do anything left field or radical or bold. We're a very conservative country. We have characteristics of punching down and despite the good evidence that the Archbishop and Casey have indicated during COVID, I mean, our emergency relief queues shrunk. And I was just speaking yesterday to the Salvation Army, who was reflecting on the COVID days in which their emergency material aid completely shrunk during when people were paid and given the empowerment through payment. So here's my question, because Casey's right in relation to a policy choice. Despite the evidence and the characteristics we have as a country, and we're not making that change. And I'm just interested in what is the engagement with governments? What is our language? How do we present the possibilities of change? The welfare sector tends to advocate, but doesn't sometimes realise it's the listener's not listening or moving and acting. And I think it's the church and the welfare sector to bring these stories in a different way, because the commentary isn't really hitting through. So I'm interested in what is our narrative? What is the change narrative for the decision makers, or the change a strategy to not just advocate, but actually say that these are the things that we think will be compelling enough to see a policy change or policy leverage in the right direction?
I think there's a range of things you've opened up there, Paul, and I think it is about this appetite for us to have empathetic leadership at the level of national discourse, the kind of stuff that Scott was talking about at a personal level. But I think for and we know that when there have been empathetic policies, Australians have responded well. I mean, I was thinking of, if you look sort of even with external affairs policies, the time of the Tiananmen Square massacre, Bob Hawke's response and opening for the Chinese students to stay here because of the sense Australian people, they responded empathetically because they had empathetic leadership. And I think you can give many examples of that, where we've had empathetic kind of leadership that actually people say, yes, we get, because the narrative of leadership is speaking about the things that most people can tune into. Now, whether modern politics allows that to happen, and whether the analysis after the failed referendum on the weekend will persuade people away from that. But I think that kind of empathetic leadership, which I guess can be easily undermined by some, I think as Tony Abbott once said, I'm the opposition leader, I'm here to oppose things. So, you oppose it, you just be the stone under the foot of the people trying to put that. You can certainly take approaches where you say they're not being worldly enough. They're kind of we've all heard that. All heard that rhetoric, all heard that kind of, and it gets into the kind of the blaming thing. So I think that there is a choice we've actually got in public leadership as to whether it is an empathetic leadership or it is something different, which is more like the blaming, the lifters and the leaners. These are the deserving poor, but these are undeserving. These are the people who can't come to our country because we set the conditions under which anyone can come here, most of which we know are false in the reality, but the rhetoric seems to grip our public attention. So, I think it is, and that's a responsibility for all of us to actually engage in a public discourse which actually does put forward some of that language, the kind of language that Scott has described to us. But I think that there's something about us as a nation and the kind of leadership we value and encourage. And I think we should be doing some more to encourage that kind of empathetic leadership.
I do. I take Paul's point. I think we sometimes miss. We live in a society where being rich is taken as a proxy for success. So when people look back and have those regrets and things like that. And there's part of me that thinks that as an advocate, I should seek to understand that that's the general narrative, and then walk alongside that narrative with one that makes sense to them. Jumping up and down and saying it isn't fair doesn't always handle it. But it leads me into an ethical dilemma where if I play the instrumental game and say, well, we should increase job seeker because people at the lowest income levels re-spend their money, and that has a multiplier effect, and that's good for the economy, and we all know the economy is good for the planet and good for humans, don't we? Versus that, my internalized view, which is that every human being, and we would all share this view, I think, has an intrinsic value, and the environment has an intrinsic value. So I do struggle with that dilemma, and changing the narrative to a sense that there is a different way of living, and there's a different way, and that the economy simply measures how we're living rather than being the reason for us to live, is a harder road, and it might not have so many wins in the short term. So there's a bit about trying to do a bit of both. But I do think sometimes that we diminish our advocacy when we do say things like, look, this will be better for the economy. We might get the short-term win, but we might diminish that overall ability to overturn this sense that transactions aren't good for human flourishing, and that being wealthy is not a proxy for success, a successful life.
Scott, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, look, I'm very much about getting alongside people across the spectrum. I was lucky enough to get a scholarship. I went to Campbell Grammar here. I go to the Athenaeum. I know lots of wealthy people. And one of the things that I've got to know recently is that they're also very anxious. And I think, part of advocacy is that one-on-one work with people who are in a position to help and make a difference. And to actually, honestly, spend time together with them and just hear their fears. Because one of the reasons why we're not moving forward is that it's not just people in the middle and in Struggle Street that are scared. It's the wealthy as well. And because they don't have a sense that others are around them and for them. They feel like it's a grip it and rip it world too. So they're not going to open the hand. It's a fist. So we need to be showing that there are networks of care that are real. These real friendship networks that they can reliably think, I can rely on them when I'm well, when I'm struggling in my marriage, whatever it is. And I think it's only when they have lived evidence that there are people for them and that it's not all going to fall apart and that God is for them, that only then does the transformation come where the fist can slowly open. So, in my own experience with my old school friends, they're very anxious and they would like to help. And that sense of mateship and helping hasn't gone, but I tell you what, it's pretty overwhelmed by the way things are going. And unless we spend time together and show that their fears are perhaps not true and people may love them, we're in trouble. So again, it's about the person at the centre. It's about everyday engagements with people across society, and that's how things will change. My granddad was a lobbyist in Canberra. My dad's been involved in public ministry and so forth, and both those guys will tell you it's about getting alongside people. So I think that's the lesson for me, just get in there, be involved, and show what things could be.
I think we have time for one more quick question. Thank you.
I'm Jananne Taylor from TMA, Melbourne Anglican, and I just wanted to ask, there's some evidence that's come out in the last year that quite a number of people are foregoing professional mental health services and medication because of the cost of living
Yes.
crisis.
Yes.
And I just wondered, is there a space for Christian organisations in that space? And if so, do you have any examples of organisations that have been trying to help?
Yeah, so in the southeast, I know that, so one of the problems is yep, you can get your referral for 10 sessions, right, your mental health plan. The thing is, you go to a psychologist and then they'll charge you the gap, and people can't afford that gap. So what some Christian organisations have tried to do is set up subsidised services whereby they don't charge the gap. They're increasingly rare, and I know that 2 have been recently shut down, which is really sad. So I know in the southeast there's the desire to do that. I just don't know if after COVID they've done that. So where I work at Ridley College, we have a whole system of referral for people that are struggling, but we're very aware that one of the issues for people is actually paying for those services. And unless they can get support from their families or their churches, it is true people don't access the services. It's very sad. And that's just the way things are. It's really rough.
Well, can I thank, on your behalf, Archbishop Philip, Scott and Casey for this very significant and important conversation this morning. And thank you too for your attendance. May I wish you a blessed day, and will you thank our speakers this morning?
Thanks.